So, we were on the legislator last time, the lawgiver, and we want to talk a little bit more about that because we have Rousseau developing this first idea of what it takes to create the level of unity and purpose and patriotism that he wants to see. And he says that this lawgiver should almost loom in people's minds like a mythological lawgiver, like Utopus from Thomas More's Utopia, or Lycurgus from Sparta, or some great figure, Romulus, from Rome, that may have been or may have not been a demigod, that may or may not have been real. So this lawgiver is somebody who sets the Constitution like Moses gave the Ten Commandments, more or less, right? And in doing this, in setting this Constitution, these original fundamental laws, he says he alters human nature. Okay, and I want to point out a passage here where he discusses how he alters human nature, and then ask you whether our own American founders did something like this in a way when they created the Constitution. Let's see. I'm on the wrong page here. 442, over on the right-hand side, under Chapter 7 on the legislator, he says, "He who dares to undertake the establishment of a people," because that's nice, the establishment of a people, not just a government, "should feel that he is, so to speak, in a position to change human nature, to transform each individual, who by himself is a perfect and solitary whole, into a part of a larger whole, from which this individual receives, in a sense, his life and his being. To alter man's constitution in order to strengthen it." By constitution there he means human nature. Okay, so we could read, "to alter human nature in order to strengthen it, to substitute a partial and moral existence for the physical and independent existence we all have received from nature." So we go from being independent to being dependent, from whole as an individual to only part of a larger whole. Okay? In a word, he says, he must deny man his own forces in order to give him forces that are alien to him and that he cannot make use of without the help of others. Okay? So again, in the natural state we do for ourselves. So when he says forces alien to him, we're giving him social forces. We're giving him the forces of all in the community, and that is unnatural in his view. Okay? The more these natural forces are dead and obliterated, and the greater and more durable are the acquired social forces, the more too is the institution solid and perfect. So you can't have people, as say John Locke has them, partly still natural. Okay? The ultimate stop on government for Locke is we always have this natural instinct, not only to self-preservation, but the desire of freedom, and government can't take that away, and so we're going to think of government as something that serves our needs and our rights, okay? And if government doesn't do that, since we don't see government as always our will, doing our will, but able to run contrary to our will, then we have a right to object and either to go and vote perhaps contrary to the majority, or even to rebel, okay? But this seems like a much greater alienation of our rights, and as he puts it, he's not even using rights language here, our forces, okay, to the whole. We completely are absorbed in that larger whole. So he says, this is what it takes for the legislator to create a people, a true people. Thus, he says, if each citizen is nothing and can do nothing except in concert with all the others, and if the force acquired by the whole is equal or superior to the sum of the natural forces of all the individuals, one can say that the legislation has achieved the highest possible point of perfection. Okay. Now in part 3, he's going to talk about many forms of government that don't achieve this absolute perfection. And sort of like Plato, he goes through different types of government, and he wants you to think about them in relative to this perfection. Okay? So what exactly is this perfection? How are you reading this in your own mind? What do you envision? And is it anything like what the American founders did when they created the government, the Constitution? Well,
I think in the sense of like creating a new type of like human nature, they kind of did that.
okay.
Like Dr. Brinkey talked last semester about like how our foundation is solid but low. That was kind of like a new thing.
Yes.
And the focus on rights, and it's kind of like they were carrying out the like political governmental experiments drawn from like the law thinkers, and they're like, all right, let's give it a go.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it was like Rousseau, or Rousseau in particular, liked what they did.
Right.
But like in the sense that it was like novel.
He wouldn't like the type of person that was created, but
He would like the experiment.
you could see that created a different type of human nature. You could say that, right? Okay. So in that sense, you see liberalism as a sort of ideology that was more or less imposed upon people with the Constitution, and that changed and shaped the way people thought. Okay? As opposed to, maybe Madison, as he was writing it, might have said to himself, I am, this reflects human nature as I understand it. I'm not making it. I'm shaping the Constitution around human nature. But it is quite possible, and I think this is how Rousseau would see it, is that they were the founders, Madison, Jefferson, and the others, but particularly Madison in the case of the Constitution, was that lawgiver. And through the creation of these laws, he created a people with certain beliefs, with certain behaviors that are not natural, but which he desired. Okay, that's the way he would see it. And I agree, he wouldn't like the particular type of person that was the outcome of this.
But even like the figurehead, like we talked about in your class last spring, of how people will like cite, well, George Washington said this in his farewell address, kind of like utopists, you know?
Yeah, so there's that too. We still look back. There's still an attempt to help Americans look back and see these founders as greater than just ordinary human beings, right? They're seen as geniuses, almost like demigods. We mythologize them. We get upset when historians come along and point out things that don't seem perfect about them, and it becomes an ideological battle that we wage about what will we say about the founders, right? Because that's how important they are. Rousseau is saying the human mind loves to do this, right? I mean, if we have a monarch, this is part of what the institution of the monarchy is all about, and probably why in Great Britain we still, the United Kingdom still has a monarch, even though she doesn't really have anything to do of substance now, because people still think of that monarchy as the symbol and sort of the glory of their nation, right? And it creates this focus for them, a sense of unity and pride. Well, that's squared when it comes to a founder figure. They're no longer with us, but that means that we can even elevate them more, unlike the queen, who has to come out wearing whatever she's wearing that day, and the hat may be crooked. The founders can just be created in our minds who we want them to be. And Rousseau would say that this is good. It creates stability. It creates a sense of unity and purpose. And we don't want people to come along and teach us that our founders are or were flawed somehow. This doesn't serve a good purpose. Okay?
So he would be against the argument that when people come out and say that they were only doing it for themselves and for wealthy property owners, he would.
Yeah, he would.
It's a double-edged
sword, I guess. As far as the objective of keeping the state together, absolutely, he would criticize that.
Mhm.
Okay, those are our founders. They, in his view, as Becca pointed out, probably didn't create the best of countries from Rousseau's perspective. But yet, if you want stability, if you want, unity and stability and purpose, you do not go back and criticize those people. Okay. Now, would it be better for us to have a new founding under different principles? Perhaps.
How? You mean like if the four of us one day were just like, okay, we don't really like what's going on right now, like Patriot Act, whatever, so we're now going to write a new constitution?
We'd have to have enough people behind us, obviously, but Rousseau's not against all revolutions. He does seem to favor stability, which makes you wonder what he would say in this case. What would Rousseau say when he sees a government that has achieved quite a bit of stability? And as we'll see, he says in Book 3, mixed government is far from perfect. It's sort of, mixed government is what you get when you can't do anything better than that. That's kind of his opinion, okay? So what would he say, since we've been around quite a while now, we seem to be able to survive, but yet I think he would see our government as encouraging vices of all kinds. Materialism, individualism running rampant, egalitarianism of the bad kind, of the kind that basically says leveling kind, nobody will stand out. All of these things he would not admire. He also, I don't know, does he? Yeah. More so in the first discourse. I read the first discourse over again last night. That he gets into martial virtue in the first discourse. He admires warlike virtue, like he admires Sparta, for instance, in Rome before it crumbled and got all corrupt from too much civilization. And today we have and it's because of liberalism, such a sort of divided attitude about the military, about America's role in the world. I think Rousseau wouldn't admire that either. The sort of fearfulness of war and so forth. Of course, there's very good reasons for that because war has become so incredibly deadly. But nevertheless, so under these circumstances where you've got a regime that's putting out what he would consider to be very poor citizens or maybe no citizens at all, would he advocate for a revolution? He's not that conservative, is he?
Like you said, he would have to argue that there would have to be enough people to rise up, and I don't think right now there would be enough.
There's not enough, you're right. No, there's not, because people are relatively satisfied enough that they will not do that.
However, the United States government doesn't have a monopoly on force.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about what it takes to rebel, maybe you don't have to have you have to have just a large enough group who's willing and has that other part of who shares a monopoly on force.
Mm-hmm. Or you have to have a military that splits from the government.
Well, but all the military contractors who don't, I guess, technically work for the military.
Sort of not. They're private. Yeah, right. So possibly it could happen in that way. And I don't think that Rousseau would necessarily disapprove. That's the interesting thing about Rousseau. This is an open question. I don't have a good answer to this. I just think that if he could see the American system, I know one thing for sure, he would not be happy. He would be disappointed. And he would perhaps would welcome change, but what path that would take, I don't know. Another thing that's missing in America that he admired so much was strong religion. This despite the fact that Rousseau may not have himself been terribly religious, but he thought that religion was really necessary for creating good, honest citizens, for creating that sense of unity and purpose.
He's saying the fact that we don't force our citizens to go to church, That's
Well,
what
We
it
don't
should
even
be.
have
Or
a
that we have like a
standardized
standard.
religion.
We
Yeah.
don't have a standardized religion.
Okay.
We don't even have a strong civil religion. You know, people will argue that America has a civil religion and we have a sort of civil religion. Well, that's things like, you know, the 4th of July celebrations, Memorial Day, you know, attempts to evoke patriotism in presidential speeches and things like that. But it doesn't go very far and it's not very strong. Rousseau would want something much stronger and tied with actual godly religion. Okay, so not secular in nature, but tied to actual, you know, religion. And this is why he seems to like Geneva so much and why he returned to it. I don't usually have you read footnotes, but there's a footnote 12 on page 443 that's written by Rousseau. And he says, those who view Calvin simply as a theologian failed to grasp the extent of his genius. The codification of our wise edicts, in which he had a large role, does him as much honor as his Institutes, a work by Calvin. Whatever revolution time may bring out in our cult, okay, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Presbyterianism, is what comes out of Calvin. Am I right?
Yeah.
I think so. So long as the love of homeland and of liberty is not extinguished among us, the memory of this great man will never cease to be held sacred. Okay. Now, as it says here on your slide, on the bottom right of page 6 of your handout here, Geneva was formed as a government in the mid-16th century, and one of the first things that was done by Calvin was to expel anyone who disagreed with him. Okay? So all Catholics and any non-conforming Protestants had to leave Geneva. So by doing this, it was a small city-state, they achieved a lot of homogeneity, which I think is Rousseau's ideal for how you get this very unanimous people going. It has to be small, and you have to have a singular faith.
They had a law against swearing.
Yes.
How do you institute that?
You
Somebody
punish
hears
people
you
that you hear
swear,
swearing.
Just throw them in jail for that or something.
Right, you know. But in Salem, right, they had stocks,
Yeah.
you know, in America in the early colonies. So if you get caught doing or saying something immoral, you go into the stocks. You're there all day. Everybody sees you. They throw stuff at you. It's embarrassing
I don't think
and uncomfortable.
I don't think anything quite like this would ever work today.
No, not today, no.
Definitely not.
If
I
you
think
have to like
that-
study your tone like Salem or Geneva and like, oops, a cuss word slips from your mouth and someone hears you and they're like, all right, go to the...
Yeah, they haul you to the magistrate, you know.
All you did is shackles.
And you imagine how, you know, this would create problems within families, where this again, I use the term ideological intentionally here, you know, highly ideological results happen where, you know, children who hear their dad swear, you know, tell the pastor. I mean, this type of thing it makes everybody constantly fearful, okay? When Hobbes wrote Behemoth, writing about the English Civil War, and he talked about the aftermath of the Civil War, which in England's case was the rule of Oliver Cromwell, who was a Calvinist. Cromwell brought this type of blue law Calvinism to England. Blue laws are what we call all these laws against things like swearing, dancing, drinking. Do I have drinking there? Drinking was included, no drinking, gambling, etc. He said, you know, this was too much for the English people. They wanted to expel their monarch. They, I think, admired Cromwell as a general, but then when he became a ruler, he did all of these things. And apparently, many of them thought that his rhetoric wouldn't match his actions, but it did. And so people began to feel terribly oppressed. And Hobbes says they just got so tired of this tyranny, basically, of morality, that they actually rebelled against Richard, his son, who after he died ruled in his stead, and they brought back Charles II and restored the monarchy, because after all, it wasn't so bad. So yes, I mean, even highly religious people who try to lead terribly upright lives will find it irritating to have somebody else telling them they must. See what I mean? So it's uncomfortable for an awful lot of people, even very, very staunch, religious people can get tired of somebody telling them what to do, especially if they think that somebody isn't as good as they are, which frequently happens. They look at what Oliver's doing, and they say, well, that's perhaps in some ways suspect, isn't quite what a Christian ought to do, and this makes them even more resentful.
It's kind of odd to me that, like, how you were saying, like, having all of this, I guess, rules and everything imposed on these people, and it makes them fearful. That just leads to more suspicion throughout, the community, which isn't going to lead to any kind of unity.
Right.
Because it's going to make people, I don't know if you're going to tell on me, I don't really want to get close to you, I don't like you, go away, because if I do something bad, you'll tell on me and I'll get thrown in the stocks, or I'll get thrown in jail, or whatever.
You kind of look at it too, kind of how you said, how it can never work in contemporary society. Probably the closest we've ever got to something sort of like this in the U.S. was probably Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And you see what happened then.
Right, people got around it, people went
And
underground.
people were always suspicious of each other, or what was going on. So,
Or like Gestapo type stuff.
Yeah.
My neighbor's gonna tell on me. Or the sedition threats.
Yeah, so now you've got something to blackmail people with, and to threaten them with, and control them with, and you get governmental as well as private corruption. That's where the mafia in America was born, basically.
As much as, I guess, vices aren't necessarily seen as a good thing, I would almost prefer having people have vices and allow them their, their time to do their thing than have everybody always suspicious of each other.
Well, and think about this irony. If you have a country in which vices are allowed, they may not always be admired, but allowed, then if you choose to do better than the average, it's a genuine improvement of your character, right? So you have the opportunity to be a better person in a situation of freedom more than you do in a situation like this, where there's always, I'm doing it partly out of fear, for what other people will say if I don't, okay? Not to mention some of these are really difficult to really tie back to biblical teaching. And for Protestants who read the Bible, this was their claim to fame. They read the Bible, right? So
Does the Bible prohibit drinking?
no, absolutely not.
Okay.
No, I mean, one of the last things Christ said was, I won't drink of the fruit of the vine until I with my Father in heaven again, after he just drank it with the Last Supper. So no, not at all. Neither is there a rule against dancing, although I think there's some Old Testament passage somewhere that criticizes women dancing in the church, and that's where they get. And this is what happens is radical folks like Calvin will take one little passage.
I'm trying. Yeah.
This is it, right? So you suspect anybody who takes one little passage and kind of runs with it in a scriptural text.
That's where you get today, like, a lot of the criticism on Christianity is because there'll be, a lot of times people go to church to either try it out or do something or other, and, they'll be all hellfire and brimstone about one particular thing. It's just
Right.
like,
One thing.
I'm gonna go.
Yeah. One thing, and then, everything else is off. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it's an aspect of human nature to be attracted to that for a variety of reasons. It does make you feel more unified. It creates an in-group and an out-group, right? It makes you feel morally superior in some ways to others and so forth. So there's attractions to it, and this is why these things happen. But at the same time, people do get tired of them. Even the people who originally supported them get tired of them. Do you need me to shut the window? Because you look like you're a little chilly. I'm okay with.
That's okay.
No, I'll shut it. I'm okay at this point. I terrible smell when we first walk in. But, okay. So, at any rate, this is Calvin's Geneva, and this is something that Rousseau admired. Though, as far as the moral rules, as you know, I mean, he never married the woman that he had many children with. So, or did he eventually? He may have, I'll have to look this up again. He may have pro forma married her at a certain point, but I don't think so.
Didn't you say he married her to like get in the country?
You're right. He married her to get into England.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But it wasn't good enough because he was a Catholic, and this, Catholic marriages don't matter, even though it was, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, but it was a pro forma marriage, that's right. So, but all of those children, or many of those children, were born out of wedlock. They weren't cared for. They did not constitute anything like a traditional family. So, I mean, Rousseau's own personal morality would have differed vastly from, what would have been encouraged in Geneva.
So is he more like Machiavelli in his use of religion then?
I think so. I mean, religion is good for other people. Religion is generally a good social institution. Many liberal political philosophers would agree with that. They don't necessarily see religion as something that they can fully buy into. Tocqueville was like that in the 19th century. Tocqueville was probably either an atheist or an agnostic. He certainly wasn't a Catholic, but officially he was a Catholic. He took last rites. He said of America that the Protestant religion was something that was absolutely necessary for people to continue to be good citizens. And it should, that freedom of religion encouraged the existence of Protestantism in America, and that was good. Okay, so it's quite a common thing, and I think Rousseau would fall into that category. So we've talked about the need for a small state. That's why one of the reasons why Geneva is a great example. Obviously, America is not a small state, and Madison came at this from a completely different angle. The bigger the country, the more likely that you wouldn't have any one region or any one industry or anything like that predominate, okay, which he thought of as good. But with a small state, you have much more control and homogeneity, and you can shape people's character. Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned last time, had maybe been more influenced by Rousseau, and he argued along anti-federalist lines that we needed to encourage people to stay on the land. He was for doling out small parcels of land to people that were big enough for them to live on, but not big enough for them to expand a lot on, and to not be able to just continue to accumulate property and create big enterprises, because he felt that good citizenship came from this rather simple, rustic way of life. Okay, so in a way, he fought against the Madisonian tendency, an argument there, more in the direction of Rousseau. But he didn't win in the long run, did he? As far as desirable qualities in the people at this point, let's take a look at some of them. They should neither be too rich nor too poor. Rousseau says they should not, in other words, be in abject poverty. Like I said, simple living. Okay, simple living, but healthy living. They should be docile, meaning they should be obedient, right? Peaceful people. If we're going to work with them to make them into this ideal people, they should not have deeply rooted customs or superstitions that we have to overcome. Okay, does that make sense? Where do you find people like that?
Religion.
You better have the right religion to begin with, then. Yeah, because everybody has, and especially back then, pretty deeply rooted customs and superstitions or beliefs, okay? We should have a physical situation that prevents, kind of like Thomas More did with the Utopia, prevents the fear of sudden invasion. So it helps, like America has that, right? We have this, or did anyway, this pretty unique physical situation where we weren't threatened by nearby countries, allowing us to grow and thrive without having to put a lot into the military. But yet he also says it needs to be able to defend itself militarily, okay? So you need to have a military, all right? And it needs to be independent of other powers. So these are some of the qualifications for building this type of people. All right? Any questions about anything from part 2? So we're starting to see that we see the founding, the idea of the founder, maybe a little glimpse of civil religion, but we won't get to his full-blown commentary on civil religion and religion generally until part 4, which we're going to deal with next week. By the way, I was going to say the assignment for next week is to read part 4 and then also to read the chapter on John Stuart Mill. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit before we. What time is it? That says
It's
a quarter
about
after.
10:10.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Clock is worthless. Let's talk a little bit about part 3 then. And part 3 has a lot to do with the different types of governments that could be and are created. Okay, so here he's going to talk about the qualities of these different types of governments and what is desirable and what is more and less desirable. Okay, he defines government as an intermediate body established between the subjects and the sovereign for their mutual communication and charged with the execution of the laws and the preservation of liberty, both civil and political. Okay, the subjects are the individuals in a state. The sovereign is the people. Remember, that's how he defines it, right? And the government are the institutions that more or less act on the sovereign's behalf. Okay, I know this is, especially since the Hobbes uses sovereign in 2 different ways too. Remember, he says the sovereign is the king or the government, but the sovereign is the people, the people's will as well. Okay, so it gets a little bit confusing with Hobbes as well as Rousseau here. Okay, but he's talking about the institutions. All right, so the question then is, how do we determine the optimal number of magistrates? That is, legislators, people in charge, okay? And this is where we get the different types of government, okay? So much like Hobbes did that argument of the one, the few, and the many, Rousseau does something similar here. He surely, I know, because he addresses Hobbes directly, is influenced by Hobbes. And it seems to me that he's almost carrying on a conversation in which he both agrees and disagrees with Hobbes. So let's take a look at page 453, where he begins this argument, right before the chapter on the classifications of governments. He says, I have just proved that the government becomes slack in proportion as the magistrates are multiplied. Okay, so the more the magistrates, the number of people in the government, okay, the more slack the government becomes. That's less energy, less vigor, less action. Okay? And I have previously proved that the more numerous the people, the greater should be the increase of the repressive force. Whence it follows that the ratio of the magistrate to the government should be the inverse of the ratio of the subjects to the sovereign. That is to say, the more the state increases in size, the more the government should shrink, so that the number of leaders decreases in proportion to the increase in the number of people. Okay? So why should that be?
It almost seems backwards.
Yeah, you would think that the greater the number of people, the greater the representatives, as we would put it, would be.
Isn't everyone supposed to be part of the government?
Everyone is the sovereign. And the ideal government, okay?
But this is where he's talking about the lawmaker.
But he's going to talk about a variety of different kinds of governments and where the magistrates or the government officials fit into each one. So, yes, in his social contract, the sovereign is the people. Okay. But even in his social contract, there will be rulers who act upon the sovereign's behalf. Okay? And so, and in these lesser governments, I think he would still say the sovereign ultimately is the people, but it's not going to operate at the level of perfection that it does in his ideal city. Okay? So let's look at a little bit more of what he has to say. It might help. He says, I should add that I am speaking here only about the relative force of the government and not about its rectitude, its rightness, okay? For on the contrary, the more numerous the magistrates, the more closely the corporate will approaches the general will. Okay? The more numerous the magistrates, the more closely the corporate will approaches the general will, whereas under a single magistrate, the same corporate will is, as I have said, merely a particular will. Thus, what can be gained on the one hand is lost on the other, and the art of the legislator is to know how to determine the point at which the government's will and force, always in a reciprocal proportion, are combined in the relationship that is most advantageous to the state. I don't know if that helps or not. The bigger the state, the fewer the officials. Okay?
Is it supposed to be because at this point, the people in his ideal state being homogenous are going to, I guess, self-enforce?
Well, yeah, that's part of it. That's good.
So it'd be kind of like an interest group then? They're only going to have magistrates who already reflect like what they would want.
Yeah, exactly. In a small state, there's going to be very little disagreement, or there should be if it's done right. If you've got a lot of homogeneity, right? In a bigger state, you're going to have, by definition, more interests. If you have a lot of representatives, let's say, just to kind of reflecting back on our own system again, like we do, and we have them at all sorts of levels too. Does this create unity? Does this create a sense of, I don't know, national pride necessarily? Does it create agreement?
It creates more conflict.
It does, and we think that's good. You know, people are talking now about what we need to do is probably elect, we'll elect another Democratic president, because that way the House and the Senate, they're probably going to stay Republican, will clash with the Democratic president and we'll get less done. Or, in other times they'll argue, well, we need to have maybe one Democratic House and the other Republican so that they won't get anything done.
Yeah, but I mean, if you don't have equal representation among the people, you're not actually representing the whole of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so a portion of the people are going to feel like they're not being represented at all, so why would they even be in this contract to begin with if they're not being represented?
Well, here's his whisper of oppression, right? So he's like, the bigger we get, the more interest we're going to get. But I want to make sure that our small group represents the right interests.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I'm thinking that because of all of the problems with representative government, when you get a large state, you're automatically going to have disagreement because there's going to be all kinds of people in it. And if you closely represent all of these people, what you're going to get disagreement in the legislature. And this is going to further divide people, and it's going to alienate, and there's going to be majority versus minority. Okay?
Factions.
That's what he doesn't want, right? But if you have a monarch, let's say we get rid of Congress and the presidency, and the White House becomes a palace, and we have a monarch, okay? And the monarch has minions that go out and enforce his will, okay? Do we get more unity? He says there will be the Episcopalian religion. That'll make people happy.
I mean, with a state as big as ours, it's going to be impossible to enforce just because the U.S. is huge. You
Well,
can't
at
have
this
the
point,
manpower to do
yeah,
that.
right.
kingdoms then, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're going
The
along the
Game of Thrones
enforcing
guys.
line, you would have to have more people in the magistrate at that point to enforce it.
Yes, but they wouldn't be officials in the sense of making decisions at all. They would be, I mean, if you had the monarch, then you would have his police force and his military and his church with its priests and so forth to go out and to make sure that his laws or her laws were passed, and I mean were obeyed, I should say.
So I guess in a
Okay?
particular region, say, the people all disagreed, but they all were homogeneously disagreeing.
Yes,
They would just send somebody in and basically
Bring in the
conquer
troops.
them and
bring in the troops. That's what happened. Yeah, that's what happened in kingdoms when there was a group that disobeyed.
That's true.
They just
Yeah.
brought in the troops, put them down, made sure that everything was in order.
Let 'em down.
Yeah.
Don't they make those analogies like it's like a sick appendage, you cut off the arms or the belly limbs or something creepy?
Back in the Middle Ages, they did that they made that kind of analogy for the king. The king was the people's body, more or less. They were his feet, his legs, his arms, and so forth. They represented, or they comprised his body. And if you had, if one of the eyes went bad, you got rid of that sucker, for the greater good of the whole, So yes, they did. And Rousseau would say this is far from ideal. This is why you don't have large countries. That's not and he's thinking in European terms of something even probably the size of France being far too big. It's way too big. Geneva is more like.
so how would he, I guess, react to the U.S. and how not only are we a big country, but we integrate, not even integrate people, but we have all sorts of different people here all intermingling. None of them really agree, but it all works out for the most part.
Well, it works out in the sense that we're not constantly killing each other, but we certainly have, he would point out all the conflict, all the distrust, the disagreement, fighting and so forth, and right now with our racial issues, this would be a huge deal for him. We have, in a way, more racial mistrust than we've had since I was a young person back in the 70s.
But we are free.
Well, some people say they're free and some people say they're not.
Would he then view, because in what part of it? I think it was in book 1 when he was talking about freedom, like forcing people to be free.
Mhm.
That's would he see this as a truer form of freedom than what his enforced freedom would be then?
Nope, because, there's a terrible amount of people who are unhappy and don't feel as though this government really represents them. And the racial issue is a perfect example of that. African Americans are, at least among certain populations of African Americans, are feeling like they do not literally count in this country at this point in 2015. Like their lives are not as valuable as white lives. And there's a growing number of white people who agree that this is a true situation we have here. And it's creating a lot of disunity and dissatisfaction, And we have this challenge of bringing together people from different racial backgrounds, from different religions, some of which are very opposed to each other. The Muslim religion being the latest challenge in that, along those lines. Very, very different economic situations and so forth. And I think he would look at it and say, well, you just can't do it.
How
You
would
can
he
try.
suggest fixing it then? Just splitting up the country?
I think he probably would start with let's make the states independent, something like that, because you simply can't. Either that or create a monarchy, which is better than what we've got here. This is what he's saying here, is if you have to have a large country, create a monarchy with all of those institutions to make people come into line and argue less with each other. Because if you give people freedom under these circumstances, what you get is just constant quarreling, and nobody's happy.